Started, and is this on, David? Y'all can hear me okay? All right. Chapter 6 is where we were going to start tonight, and this begins the sealed judgments. And remember, I told you the seals was what on the scroll that seals it up, and they had little wax seals on it. I was watching a movie the other night, and I think it was about Russia or something, but they brought a document in, and it had one of those wax seals on it. It wasn't that, it was Alexander or something. Anyway, I watch a lot of history movies, and they had that seal on there, and it had the emperor's seal on it. And he took something hot and heated it up to break the seal. And the only one that could do it was the guy who was the biggest one in authority in the area, you know. And we've already determined that Jesus was the only one who had the authority to break these seals. And these first 7 judgments are called sealed judgments because it's scrolls. Some people call them scrolls, but it's sealed judgments. Each seal, as it unfolds, reveals a next phase of that judgment in this grouping. And then when you get to the 7th one, it actually opens the next set of judgments, which are the trumpets, and you go into those judgments. And then when you get to the 7th trumpet, it actually opens up the first bowl of vial or bowl of the bowl judgments. So you got a series of 7, but the last one opens up the next set of judgments. But anyway, the first and 4th judgments carried out on riders of different horses, and the Old Testament references in Zechariah chapter 6. So turn in your Bible to the book of Zechariah, and you can see how the Old Testament ties into this passage here. Yeah, Zechariah, just the first chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, I think it is. Takes me a time to find it too. It's not one of them books you go to real quick. And you have to see my pages stick together is what I'm talking about. I can kind of find it, but it's in getting through there. All right, chapter 6, and look in verse 1. We'll just read some of these verses here. I looked up again, and there before me were 4 chariots coming out from between the 2 mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses. The second chariot had black horses. The third white, and the 4th dappled, all of them powerful. And then it says, I asked the angel who was speaking to me, what are these, my Lord? And the angel answered, these are the 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. The one with the black horses is going toward the north country, the one with the white horses toward the west, and the one with the dappled horses toward the south. And that's a pale horse. It's just another word that's used in the English to describe that. When the powerful horses went out, they were straining to go throughout the whole earth. And he said, go throughout the earth. So they went throughout the earth. Then he called to me, and he said, look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north. So this is a vision that Zechariah saw centuries before, and then John is seeing in his vision these judgments of these 4 horsemen again. This time they've given more definition, they're given more specific task, and they represent more specific things in judgments. They precede the tribulation and are operative throughout history. So if we look at a timeline, and I've drawn it before, and we look at time, out here is the tribulation, which is the last 7 years. And then we move in this direction. Then these judgments, the sealed judgments, are actually occurring back here, leading up to the tribulation. And Matthew 24, chapter 24, we look at that briefly. We've already looked at it one time. And then Mark 13 actually give us some information of some of the events that's going to be happening even before we get to the tribulation. So the sealed judgments are already been opened, and the 4 horsemen are riding, which means they're already beginning to do things in the earth that are preceding the tribulations. Everybody with me on the timeline? And that's an interesting fact. So when you hear people all the time talking about, we feel like we're at the end of the world, it's end times. Well, going back in church history, every generation sees these signs. It's not like we're the only ones that sees this. What makes things different now than versus 100 years ago or 200 years ago is what's going on in Israel. And what I mean by that, there was no nation that has ever went out of existence and come back into existence except the nation of Israel. In other words, in 70 AD, the Romans flattened the area. They came in and literally changed the culture, tore the temple down, tore up the priesthood, the political system, just basically disrupted the whole Jewish society, and they scattered. And not until 1948 did they start regathering again. And Britain, after World War II, was one of the nations that was instrumental in giving Israel back their land. And here's the interesting fact. It's down to almost a square mile of what they got back, of what they had when Abraham came in there. That should open your eyes. And so now, since 1948, and it says in the Old Testament several places that he would regather Israel back into a nation. And they would once again be one of the ruling nations in the world. And if you stop and think about it, because they're allies with us, they're one of the most powerful nations on earth because they have our backing. And, you know, under Trump, he made it even stronger by putting the embassy back in Jerusalem, which that has never, been since they've been reestablished. So I say all that to say this, that is the difference. And then the scripture says, this generation would not pass away until the Son of Man comes again. Well, the generation he's referring to is the ones that occupy Israel. So children born in 1948 are a generation, and that's usually somewhere between 80 to 90 years today. So if you put that on top of 1948, you're looking at somewhere around 2025 all the way up to 2030, far as that generation dying out. So that's why there's a lot of excitement because of that fact. But if you go back to Matthew 24 and look in there just for a moment, I'll show you some of these verses of some of these judgments, the sealed judgments that are happening now that the four horsemen are unleashing on the earth, okay? All right, if you look in Matthew 24, give me just a second. Once again, my pages stick together. I got me one of these thin Bibles a few years ago because I liked how big they were. And no one told me my eyes would get worse. And because I had a giant print Bible for a while. And, yeah, exactly. That version. But in Matthew 24, they asked Jesus, when will these things be and when will the end of the world come? And he says in verse number 4, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of war. Well, guess what? These horsemen are bearers of war. They're unleashing war on the earth. So not only do you see wars happening and increasing, but you actually hear about wars that are potentially happening. What's going on in Ukraine right now? And they've shown us pictures of the Russians getting on the border. And we got a president that doesn't know what he's, that was a deliberate slip of the tongue, okay? But we've got a president that if we go to war, we will all be speaking Russian. And so I'm already eating Chinese food because, I got to get used to it and be ready for it. But he's giving them ultimatum. You heard the ultimatum last week. Did y'all hear his speech? He said, depending on how big the intrusion is into Ukraine will depend our response. Then he had to go back the next day and said, no, any response, Well, I told my grandson who's thinking about going to Marines, I said, why don't you hold off for a little while till we see what happens to this guy, because you don't want to be in the Marines when we start a war, that's for sure. But anyway, wars and rumors of wars, there'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. It said, then you'll be handed over and persecuted. That's increasing by the Islamic people against Christianity, and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. And of course, Israel's in that position now. And at that time, there will be many turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And it says, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom, and there's another key one right here, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, what's key about that prophecy is this, is the adjective describing how much of the world will hear the gospel. The word whole was included. Now, up to that time, as far as they knew, the Roman Empire and what they land-wise and how they were, they figured the oceans were basically the end of the earth. So when they said world, they thought about the civilized Roman aspect and, of course, the barbarians that surround them, and they knew about the Far East. But that was their known world. And he added whole world. Now, we know since all of that, there is a bigger thing called the world. We know that. And so now the gospel would be preached throughout the whole world before Christ comes again. Now, we have satellites. We have the ability and technology that really was advanced, and believe it or not, under people like Jim Baker and others that helped pay for satellites. And what's that guy that comes on? He's about dead now. TBN Network. Pat Robinson. I think his son took over. Yeah, you like that, didn't you, Finley? And anyway, you look at what their ministries were, and they were doing it for themselves in many ways, but it's like Paul said, he rejoiced that the gospel's still getting out because they are putting out the gospel. Then you got, of course, Billy Graham, and then you have his son now through all his organizations, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are literally thousands of Christian organizations that have tapped into the communication system, and they are broadcasting the gospel around the clock. So that places like China and Russia have, airwaves filled with the gospel, and he says, when that is complete, when God reaches a point of saturation, he says he will send his son for his bride. So that's something else that's happening right now, okay? And that's not so much a judgment, it's one of those signs to look for. Then look in Mark chapter 13, the book of Mark, chapter 13. Some people refer to chapter 13 as the little book of Revelation. They call it the little apocalypse. When I studied the book of Mark in seminary, that's what our professor, when we got to the 13th chapter, he went into great detail. And I'll never forget, he called it the little book of Revelation because it contains a lot of information about these four horsemen and some of the sealed judgments. It says, as he was leaving the temple, and this is really about like Matthew 2, look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. He said, do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus, not one stone here will be left on another. And then he goes on to say, every one will be thrown down. And as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled? And he said, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, and the famines. These are all the beginning of birth pains. You must be on your guard. You will be handed over, and he goes through all that again. And then in verse 14, he talks about when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong in the temple, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let no one on the roof of his house go down or enter the house or take anything out, and let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequaled from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, that means God's children, whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. And at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there is he is, do not believe it, for false Christ will come. Now, the reason I read that for you is to kind of set the stage for these judgments. These sealed judgments, a lot of that is happening as I speak. A lot of it has happened. Some of it centuries ago, it has been increasing. I had some materials that I've got boxed up at the house. But when I first started my ministry 42 years ago, this was a fascinating topic to me before I studied the book of Revelation intensely. So I just took Matthew 24 and 13 and wrote these things down. Then I went to the newspapers and because that's where we had the internet and stuff, and just started documenting, clipping out stuff. When there was an earthquake, I'd cut it out. And when there was famines and stuff, I'd cut it out. And when there was false crash, like, Sun Young Moon and the Moonies and others, I'd cut it out. And I had a whole file of stuff. And the thing that I noticed was the increase, that all these things were increasing. And here's another factor. When it talks about earthquakes, well, back in Jesus' day, if there was an earthquake, most people didn't know it unless you were in the general vicinity. And so if there was a major earthquake, unless it happened near you, you didn't know it. Well, here it says there'll be earthquakes, and the King James says diverse places. Well, I looked up that old English word and looked up the original Greek word, and what that means is it's going to be all over the earth, in every country, under the ocean, above the ocean. It's a word that describes it's not going to be in one particular place, it's everywhere. Well, that's what's happening. Now we have the ability with the internet and social media, and of course all the seismic measuring tools. Charleston has one of the biggest ones. I don't know if you know that, Charleston Southern University. They have a seismograph, and they can measure earthquakes all over the world, and particularly in this area. And long story short, there's been a major increase in major earthquakes, and the tremors in the earth are increasing over time. Now, we haven't always measured earthquakes, but since we've been measuring them, you see this graph. So that tells us, and some of the largest ones, back in 1992, there was one that registered 9.2 on the Richter scale. Well, 10 is a complete devastation of the earth. This one was over there where it unleashed the tsunami that killed almost 200-something thousand people. Well, that particular earthquake was 9.2. And they said it actually shook the Earth's axis. The Earth actually wobbled as it's moving through space. That is just overwhelming. Because see, in a Richter scale, when they talk about the guy who designed it, it's like this. Well, you got these exponents and stuff, like, for those of you who like math. So like this is 10 to the maybe second power here. Man, by the time you get up here, it's like, I'm just exaggerating, 10 to the maybe 1,000th power or whatever. So the difference between these two, so when you say an earthquake of 5 on the Richter scale, that's pretty massive. But if you go to a 6 and a 7, when you get to a 9, that's devastating. And I mean, that sent a big burp across the ocean, and that's the reason why people that were unsuspecting drowned, because of the tsunamis that came off that earthquake. And I've seen pictures of some. I don't know if y'all remember that, but it was in 1992, I think it was. And I'm just a science guy. I like that kind of stuff. But also I look at my Bible, and my master is saying, watch for these signs. Now, don't get worried about them. Don't sit around and bite your fingernails off over it, but just get excited, he said, because there's birth pains, like a woman fixing to have a baby. She says, oh, it's getting close, and gets a kicker here and there. It means it's coming, and so this was. Now, let's go back to our notes. The book contains, talking about the seal, judgments, establishment of the kingdom, in other words, gathering of his saints into the kingdom, and judgment of God upon evil powers. In Revelation 6, 1 and 2, he said, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Come is a summons to complete God's work. So the angel is telling the one rider of the on the horse. In verses 1 and 2, the first seal, war and conquest symbolizes the white horse. Some see the white horse and rider as the gospel conquering the world, and that's one interpretation, but most people see it as an actual symbol of war. All the seals reflect judgment and not blessings. So the seal judgments are not something that the world's being blessed by. It's the beginning of birth pains. It's the beginning of judgment coming. In verses 3 and 4, let me finish my point. A bow is a weapon of the Parthians. Now, I'm going to explain that in just a moment. Today, that would be Iran. Rome's most dangerous foes outside of the empire were called the Parthians. And Iran and Afghanistan was never conquered by the Greeks nor the Romans. That's as far as the empire would go. when you get over into Afghanistan and into Pakistan, they had mastered riding these elephants and camels. And they were excellent archers. And they could ride on these massive animals and shoot arrows like somebody would be a sharpshooter today. So when the Romans got there with their massive armies, they're used to fighting infantry. They have horses, but they weren't used, and so those were like the old-timey tanks, you might say, because they would put armor on the elephants and things like that. And so the Parthians, which represent the Iranians and the Afghani people, today, they were unconquerable. So John, the Revelator, seeing this vision, draws upon that picture when he uses the word bow, because the word bow is the word to describe the weapons of those people back then. Is everybody with me? So this is a conquest. Now today, of course, our weapons are not bow and arrows, but back then the bow and arrow was the most effective weapon they had from long distances. And I don't know if you saw any of the movies where they had like the 300 with the Spartans. And there's a line in there where the Persian ruler tells the Greek person that he says, we will shoot so many arrows into the air that it will darken the sun. And he turned and he told him, he said, good, we'll fight in the shade. Yeah. And I don't know if you remember that line, but it's one of the best lines in the movie. But anyway, I've studied all that too, so it's kind of interesting. But anyway, when I picture this, I picture world conquest. Now versus the crown, which would be a victor or conqueror. Verses 3 and 4. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. There again, a summons to come, and it's time to move. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. Now turn over on your notes. A red horse is simply an aggressive policy of expansionism, is what the first rider represents. The second rider represents civil war. So the white horse is expansionism, large conquering. The red horse represents civil war or internal problems between nations. Now, if you study American history, we had a civil war. And it's the bloodiest war we've had since we've been a nation. I think there was something like 675 or 80,000 they claimed were killed during that war. And about, the last statistics I heard, over 50% of them died from disease, not actually gunfire. The bloodiest battle in American history, as far as soldiers dying, happened on September the 17th at the Battle of Antietam. And to this day, we haven't seen a battle like that. And it was a Civil War battle. And it happened, up in Maryland. And, I look at those statistics and I look at our nation. But meanwhile, if you go around the world, there's civil wars everywhere. Vietnam was a civil war. Cambodia was a civil war. You go to Africa right now, and there are multiple civil wars going on that the news don't even report on. Tribal warfare, things like that. And there's literally, I guess you'd say, hundreds of conflicts that would be civil places where people are killing each other, and it makes you wonder who's stirring all this trouble up. Well, these four horsemen are part of the judgment. When God unleashed these judgments on the earth, it's a part in the consequences of sin and God beginning to ratchet up the point where he's going to bring his full wrath against the earth. And the red horse would, symbolize this. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. The black horse is a symbol of the spread of famine and shortage because of selfishness. Now, every war, major war and conflict that has happened, creates devastation. And in the wake of war will come famine, will come disease, will come shortages of food, and things like that. And it's the result of war. So you see, this horse is bringing judgment as a result of the other 2 horses that have been riding across the earth. Measure of all that was needed for daily food. Barley is what poor people ate. A penny is the average wage of labor for one day. They call it a denarius, which is approximately 16 cents. So the expression in verse 6 about the olive oil and wine really expresses that the rich will get richer. It's a way of describing that, because those were rich, only items that the rich would purchase, and the poor will get poorer. Hello. And I hear, yeah. Wine and olive oil viewed as a luxury item for some, but others understand this to mean that the basic items for life would be available, of course, for the rich. Now, the idea of inflation, which we're hearing about now, and 7% seems like a lot. And for some people, it pinches into their pocketbooks and they feel that 7% increase, but for the rich, they don't. You understand what I'm saying? They really don't. It's just it's just an inconvenience. But if you go back and study Venezuela before they became a socialist country, and look at their economy when the oil was driving their economy, and before it came under communist rule, and I've heard people talk about this, their money value of their money was pretty good. You could go out and purchase something and you didn't have to spend as much. But as it worsened, this is like after World War II also. After World War II, I've heard stories that people were carrying around wheelbarrows of German marks and, just to buy a loaf of bread. And I've heard that some of the countries in Africa are like that now. In other words, you go to the store and buy a loaf of bread for $1.50 or $2 or whatever. Now it's taking a whole week's paycheck just to get one loaf of bread. That's inflation. And one of the aspects of war and one of the judgments that's going to come is that the economies are going to suffer tremendously. The poor get poorer, the rich get richer, because they learn how to make money on both ends of the deal. They don't care that the market crashes. They don't care that the economy crashes. They don't care if people get killed, and they don't care if a virus kills 1 million or 10 million, or it doesn't matter to them, because they set themselves up that when things fail, they are invested in those things to build things back. And one of the laws of sinful man in this world is, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But what it is with the rich, they make money on both ends. They know how to do it. They're wicked at the expense of people. Well, that in itself is like a judgment. And the horse that is riding, will bring this forth. Verses 7 and 8. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. My boat was that color, I mentioned that. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague. And plague is another way for pestilence or disease. And by the wild beast of the earth. And of course, that's more symbolic than actually lions and tigers eating us up and things like that. The pale horse is the color of death. You've had people say, "You look so pale." Last week, Gail said I looked kind of pale. She said, "You look kind of pale." I said, "I've been riding a horse all night. That pale horse come through here last night. I've been riding a pale horse." When you get sick, they say your color changes. Y'all, know what I'm talking about? And mothers and wives notice that more than men do. Would y'all agree with that statement? Bobby, you look kind of pale tonight. Yeah, look at me. Look at me. But when you've got disease and famine and people are hungry, then the natural appearance, changes. Now, let's look at this term death and look at the Hades. Of course, the pale color, the color of death, the lack of health, pestilent, also is an ashen color, which presents fear. Pestilence is another word for disease, or like today, COVID-19. Do you think it scared people going through what we've been through? How much fear do you think's in the world today because of COVID-19? Did it scare you when it first came out? What was you feeling when you first started hearing about it? What was going through your mind?
Well, this is just something else.
Well, they shut us down, they said, for 2 weeks. Gail and I didn't go out of the house for 2 weeks. Now, on Sunday, I went to church, but it was just me and her at church. We had 5 people in church for a month, and we broadcasted our services. And for Easter, I think there were 6 of us in the church. Huh? You had the parking lot? Yeah, we actually went to church and I broadcast on Facebook and YouTube. And, that was weird. So I told Gail, I said, next Sunday one of us needs to walk the aisle so we can think people, look like somebody getting saved around here or something. And I told the band, I said, next week y'all need to come up here and repent. And then we can say, and I told George he could quit the church and join. He was a drummer. He's an older fella. He's a professor at the Citadel, wonderful fella. And in fact, he gave me a coat before I left with the Citadel. And I told him, I said, George, why don't you just say you're going somewhere else and join again? And he started laughing, I said, we got to have a better appearance on TV. But I remember people were scared to death. The rumors were running around that, everybody was going to die. If you get this, you hear people got sick and people were dying. Some people died. But I remember through the years, I remember one year there was close to 100,000 people died from the flu. And they didn't lock us down. I mean, some of the schools shut down temporarily, and they quarantined the sick. They didn't quarantine everybody. So here's my thing. When that came out, and I mentioned this briefly before, but in a little more detail, when that pestilence hit the world, what made it different from the other diseases was this was worldwide. That's the first thing you should have noticed. The second thing you should have noticed was they were tracking it. And they were tracking it close. And they had the numbers on your TV screen. They had the numbers in the paper. They were constantly tracking it. Number three, they made it a political entity. In other words, it was tied into policy. And then they started putting the clamps down and telling us how they were going to fight this. And their way of doing it was to destroy the economies. And when they did that, that's, of course, when my red flag went up, because I've always said, and we'll get to this in chapter 13, I've always said that people are not stupid. If the beast came out, in other words, the Antichrist came out and he got on TV and he said, okay, everybody that has my mark on them will be able to buy groceries, be able to go shopping, everything will be just like it was, but you've got to have my mark, Well, first of all, people's going to say 666, and people now, if they get a receipt back with 666 on it, they ball it up and burn it or throw it away. If someone gets a tag number with 666, they go back and get it changed. Everybody's scared of 666. Well, Satan's not stupid. His sign's not going to be 666. That's symbolism. It's a trinity. 6 represents a man. And by being a trinity, it's a trinity of the devil. That's all that means. So whoever this person is going to control the world, with his power and his glory working for Satan. And I've always raised the question, how can he pull that off? Because people are going to figure it out. They're not going to fall for that. Well, there you go. You watch what happened back in, 2020, and you already see his plan. He's going to make people sick. And when you get sick, he's going to have the solution, because that's what the 13th chapter says, that there'll be a great crisis. It'll be a delusion. And he will come up with a solution to this. And it will be from a government entity that will give you the solution to the problem. Now, you tell me what's going on now with COVID-19. What are they telling you? They came up with the disease. People got sick. People are dying. They let you know, it was there. It's real. Some of us have it, and we've been sick. Do what? And then they whipped out a vaccine real quick. And I love Trump, but I was real suspicious of that. I really was, because, my goodness, to get a polio vaccine took something like 4 decades. And then after that, to get a flu vaccine took another 3 or 4 decades to get the FDA to prove it. And all of a sudden, boom, within a year, less than a year, they got vaccines that will take care of us, But you get them from the government, and they're free. There you go. The red flags are flying everywhere. So now, whenever they get to the point where they really want to control us, they will really make us sick. We're getting programmed now that this is how it's going to work, and there are people resisting it, but over 2/3 of the nation haven't. They went for it. But around the world, the numbers are even higher, and they're still restricting people from doing stuff. And what are they telling you? Can't go to a restaurant. You can't keep your job. What did they tell you at work? What did they tell you at work about COVID? What's their policy if you don't? Yeah.
Well, they were going to make me have the shut.
But did they tell you had to leave if you didn't, or they were talking about? Yet the hospital is mandatory, right? All right, military, I think they backed off from that. And now people are going to court, and the only thing that's saving us is our Constitution. And it was written, 200-something years ago, 1787 when the Constitution was ratified. All right, think about that. There's a document that still holds true today for tyranny and for people to pull this stunt. So now, get this. In order for the Antichrist to take over America, he's got to get rid of the Constitution. And there are a bunch of yahoos out there now being led by the Democrats wanting a constitutional convention. And they want to bring all the states in and revamp the Constitution, rewrite it, redo it. And guess what the First Amendment will be? Our right to religious worship will go out the window. And what does the Antichrist want? If you don't worship the beast. It's right. And they'll make you sick, and they're already doing it. I see the plan now. I didn't think it was possible. When I studied this thing for years, I said they'll never pull it off in my lifetime. And bingo, in 1 year, they've already showed their blueprint, and they've already put it into action. They're seeing where the resistance is coming from. What did they do to the churches? Do you remember out in some of the states? What did they tell the people at church? Can't go to church. They were arresting pastors. First Amendment, pastors started suing them. They backed off. No First Amendment, pastors are still in jail. Churches are still closed. Do y'all hear the picture now? So it's getting closer. Okay? These four horsemen are the beginning of judgments. And what's sad is that those of us who are Christians will see these things. And they're going to happen. And there's nothing really much we can do. We can resist. But at some point, they'll even have enough authority, And some people say, well, I'll just go live up in the hills. Well, that's good. But they got drones that fly in there and zap you out with a drone in a minute. I mean, so you can't really run from anything.
God knew.
Do what?
West Virginia Hermit.
Yeah, there you go. And I've heard there's a lot of y'all from West Virginia around here, so.
Last state to go.
You think so?
But now, and I've talked to some relatives of mine, there's nothing that we as Christians are going to do to change any of this.
No.
God knew this when he created everything. So what position are we to take and what are we to do except witness and proclaim the gospel? We're not going to stop anything.
No, what we can do, and I think I see this and I try to encourage you, and I will as long as I'm preaching here, that if we focus on seeking first his kingdom, in other words, doing his work. I mean, I'm talking about zealously. I'm talking about strongly. I'm talking about not just on and off again, but really get serious about reaching out and winning lost people. He said, if you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, he said he would add everything to you. Then in other words, in the midst of all this coming down, he'll put his hedge around you. He really will. And I'll use an illustration of when Hugo hit Somerville. Hugo was a pretty bad hurricane. Y'all know about that. Well, when I came out of my house that morning, I was literally shocked because I was already in terror from living through that. And I said, I made a promise to the Lord, I'll never be a fool and stay in a hurricane again. And I haven't since then. But when I came out and I looked at all the damage and devastation, my memory flashed back to Egypt. When those 10 plagues hit Egypt, the Bible says the Israelites were right there with the Egyptians. I'm talking about right there in their midst in an area called Goshen, and right where the Nile River runs north into the Mediterranean, and that's where they were located. Well, the major centers, commercial centers of Egypt was right, they're like this. So here you have all these insects, you have all these plagues, and it's almost like there was a line of, use a big word, demarcation. There was a separation between God's people and the plagues, because the plagues were a judgment. They weren't meant for God's people. They were a judgment on Egypt. So that meant when the sun went out, it was dark in Egypt, but it wasn't dark in Goshen. Now, how do you do that? God. And he did that deliberately so that they could see that these were judgments that God was bringing against Egypt, not against Israel. Now, one of the things that happens with these seal judgments, because we're living on the earth, we become victims of some of this. We really do. And, we just ask of God's mercy, his protection and grace. But you hit the nail on the head. If we're busy doing the Father's business, then he's going to keep us in business. Does that make sense? If it's his business and we're about his business, he's not going to take his employees and get rid of them. He wants his business done. And there's going to be a lot of people asking questions. This is a great time to start making this a conversation piece among our family and different ones, so that when they say, man, there's something weird going on, you add the weirdness to it. Oh, yeah, you're right. It's in the Bible. You know, these things are going to happen, you know. And these sealed judgments, Matthew 24, tell them to read it. Tell them to read Mark 13. Say, I know you have a hard time. You want to read Revelation? Just read Matthew 24 and Matthew 13 for yourself, and then ask yourself a question, what's going on? Y'all follow me? And bait them. You know, next few Sundays I'm going to be preaching about fishing and, you know, how we can go fishing for the Lord and start getting people back in church and stuff. But the thing is that I really believe it's not my business to try to lock down, you know, these preppers. I know that some preparation is needed because the food's upset and things like that. But I am a firm believer that God will take care of me if I seek first his kingdom. He told me that. And if that's not true, then I've been following the false God. He said, seek first his kingdom. And he said, what was the things? Food, shelter, clothing. And he dresses the lilies of the field like this, and he feeds the birds of the air. And I've sometimes sat in my backyard, and I had some bird feeder stuff, and I watched the birds. And I noticed they were eating all kinds of stuff, and I could put stuff out there for them. God takes care of them, you know. And I'm more important than some little bird. I got a bird brain. You listening to me? Talk to me, yeah. You listen to me. But I knew you was thinking that when I said it, so I just went ahead. All right, let's go a little bit further. It says here in verse number 9 and 11. Oh, yeah, one thing I need to mention. It said death and Hades. If you read your King James Bible, it says hell. Am I right? You'll have hell there. Who's got King James? It says death and hell, don't it? Now, I told you one time before, there's 3 words in the Bible that translate into hell. And I'll give you a quick lesson on it. And these 3 words, all 3 of them in the King James Bible come out as hell. In the Old Testament, the word is Sheol, and it comes out in the King James as hell, okay? Now, Hades was the brother of Zeus, and he had the control of the dead. That was his realm. I don't know if you remember Greek mythology, but real quick, y'all remember the lady who had the snakes on her head, Medusa? You remember that? You looked at her. I knew some girls that looked like Medusa in high school. If you looked at them, you turned to stone. I'd throw that in there because I was dating the prettiest woman in the valley. So that's right. But anyway, I thought y'all needed a little laughter sometimes. But to get Hades, to get rid of him, because he was fighting against Zeus, they went and got Medusa's head and cut it off and took it in a sack. And I forget which one was, I don't know, it wasn't Hercules, it was Jason or one of them. And he carried the sack up there and showed it to Hades turned to stone. That did him in. And they were trying to say they could get rid of the grave. But anyway, in Greek mythology, Hades is a place of the dead. And in Hades, there was a place called the River Styx. And you had a place for the good guys. You had a place for the bad guys. And the River Styx was there in a lake of fire. And when someone died, they put coins in their eyes. And the coins was to pay the ferryman. And the ferryman would carry you across the River Styx to the good side. And if you didn't have, money, or someone wanted to condemn you to the bad side of hell or Hades, then they wouldn't put the money in your eyes, and then you'd be carried by to the wrong place. Now that's their way of seeing the afterlife. Everybody with me? So when our Bible got written, some places the writers used Hades. Some places they used Gehenna. I guess where Gehenna is. A little north of Jerusalem. It's a ravine area. And it's where everybody took their trash. Now here, because I was raised up here, out at the airport, at the Lock and Dam, they used to take all the trash out there. I don't know what they do now. And it burned all the time. They kept it burning. And then they finally made them stop. But they were filling in those ravines along before you get to the river there. And we go out there to watch the airplanes, and all that smell and smoke and stuff like that. Well, Gehenna, they took all their dead animals and things out there in their garbage and set it on fire, and it burned all the time. So Jesus talking about Gehenna, when he talked about hell, and he said hell fire, he used this word, Gehenna. Because he says the worm will not die. Decay, maggots, whatever, fire, burning. So when Jesus talked about a place of torment, he always used Gehenna. He didn't use Hades. Because in Hades, there was a good side and a bad side. I'm going to bring you up on that in a moment. This word here is only used one time in the book of Peter, and it talks about where all the demons are. And it's translated hell. It's the lowest place in hell. It's the most awful place, and it was reserved for Satan, and they're all chained up one day and all this stuff. And that's this one here. And so when hell was created, talking about Gehenna and this, God, and you read the Bible, hell was not created for man. It was created for the demons and Satan. So when people tell me, they'll say, well, if God's such a loving God, why would he send anybody to hell? I said, he doesn't. He didn't create hell for us. I said, you choose to go there yourself. If you reject heaven, then it's an automatic. There's only two destinations after life, heaven or hell. And these two describe that. Now, in Luke 16, Jesus tells a story of the rich man and the poor and Lazarus. What happened? They both died. Lazarus kept begging for food and stuff, and the rich man ignored him. And it says, and the rich man was carried, and the King James says hell, but if you look in the original language, it says Hades. And then it said that Lazarus got carried to the bosom of Abraham. All right, now, what does that mean? Going back to Hades, the good side and the bad side, the Jews believed there was a place called the bosom of Abraham, that where all the patriarchs went. They couldn't go to heaven yet because Jesus hadn't died on the cross. Until Jesus died on the cross, nobody could see the face of God. After Jesus died on the cross, you could go to be with God. And that's why he told the thief on the cross, this day you'll be with me in paradise, which is the word for heaven. So the thief got to go right from death into life, into heaven. And after that point, from that day forward, everybody goes straight to heaven if you're born again, okay? But the Lazarus in Hades, and it says that the rich man in Hades lifted up his eyes and he was in torment. So he's in that part called Gehenna. You follow me? And one of the torments of hell, and this is something you need to tell your friends when they say they want Jesus, they get to see you walk through heaven for eternity. That's a fact. It's a glass ceiling. Heaven has a glass floor. People can't see through the floor in heaven, but the Bible says those in torment see into heaven, and they actually have a memory of what went on the earth. And that's what he said, because he says, go get my 5 brothers and warn them not to come here. He didn't ask to get out. And that's another peculiar thing about hell. Nobody ever asked to get out of there. And I'll show you in Revelation, that's one of the principles of hell, that when you get there, you never ask to get out. Because if you got there because you wouldn't bow before Jesus, you ain't about to bow before him to get out. And you say, old people would be suffering, they'd be ready to get out. No, because the only way to get out is to bow before God. And their hearts are so hard, they won't do that. See? And I'll show you that later on when the judgments start happening. But here's the thing. So death and Hades, following these 4 horsemen, it says that you die and they go into the grave. That's what the term is. But in the grave, if they don't know the Lord, they go to Gehenna. And if they know the Lord, of course, they go to paradise. Okay? Is everybody with me now? The Catholic Church has been notorious for distorting this, because they in their creed said that Jesus Christ died and descended into hell. I don't know if you've ever heard their creeds. Well, it says in the New Testament that Christ descended into Hades. And, trust me, when I've studied these languages and stuff, these are questions I wanted answers to, because I got to answer to you and I got to answer to God for telling you the facts. And what I discovered in the language and the Bible and church history is that they misquoted it. They used the word hell, and it should have been the word Hades. And when Jesus descended, there was no reason for him to go to Gehenna. He went to the good side, because that's the bosom of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the good guys, King David, they're all there waiting. And he went down there like a conqueror, brought them out of there, and people said, where'd Jesus go when he died? He went down to Hades to grab everybody and said, look, I am risen, I'm fixing to rise from the dead. You've been delivered on the cross. Your sins are covered. We're going to heaven, boys. And all that they looked forward to in faith now was fulfilled. That's what it meant when Jesus descended into hell. He descended into Hades. He went to the good side, and he didn't go down there and get the wicked people and say, hey, I forgive you now. Y'all can come back to heaven. He went to get God's people who died in faith, like Abraham, and they were brought back to be with him. And Paul talks about this in Ephesians 2. So That's the correct way of understanding the theology or teaching of our Bible. And it makes a whole lot more sense. But it's all because of words and translators. King James translators took one word, hell, and put it into every place where there was any reference to the dead. And in the Hebrew, the word Sheol, when David's little baby died, he was punished, and the little baby died. He said he was grieving, but after the baby died, he got everything, and he made a comment that he was going to be with his child. Well, he understood in faith that those who died in a righteous standing, and that baby, of course, would be there, that, he would go to be with him. Because they translated sometimes Sheol as grave. And then sometimes the King James translators translated as hell. But it doesn't fit the context. The context would be the place of the righteous or the place of the wicked, both being translated with one word. Okay. Now, I know it took a long time to do that, but did that help you a little bit to understand? So when you see that word Hades, and it's usually in the newer translations, and the reason why is because the translations are trying to correct the King James translators who just chose one word to describe three words, and behind each of those words you go back to the original text in Greek and you see the difference. And it makes a whole lot more sense, when you understand that. Well, our time has run out. I think we stopped, verse 9? The fifth seal? All right, so we looked at the first four seals. I'll make a mark here on mine. Any questions? I know we kind of went right up to our hour. Any questions? Or y'all still interested? Yeah. I tell you, it really gets, when we get into that 13th chapter, man, it just really, it makes you stop and think, and you almost want to look at your neighbor and think they're the Antichrist, when you start looking around.
Pastor, I like what David Jeremiah says, you don't have to go to heaven, and you don't have to go to hell, but you can't stay here.
No, this is true. It's one or the other. I like what a real estate guy told me. I had a friend, one of my deacons, who sold real estate for a while, and he said, you can have a good-looking house in a neighborhood, and all the houses around you are nice, and you can get it estimated, and the price will be way up there. You can take the same house, take it to the poor side of town, and put it in there, and the value drops. Now, we had a house built in an older neighborhood on a vacant lot, and the house we picked was in a neighborhood. It was a nice neighborhood. We liked the house, so we took that plan, brought it into this neighborhood, had it appraised, and it was like $50,000 less than what, which was good for me in my pocket. And when I sold it, I made money on it. But my point was location, location, location. So the thing about eternity is you're all going to live forever. The idea behind the Bible is eternal life includes quality living with Jesus. And you can't beat heaven. So why would you want to waste your time living in a poor rent neighborhood in hell where you have no air conditioning? I just don't understand that,